Hello, welcome to an Introduction to Guillotina tutorial. This tutorial will require a working environment of Python 3.6 and above. It is recommended to start with a virtual environment. Once you created it, cd into it and initialize the environment with the source command. Now pip install Guillotina. This will install all the required dependencies. The main dependencies of Guillotina are AIO HTTP, which is used for the base server implementation, Zopta interface, which is used for interface definition and adapter lookups, async PG, which is used for the PostgreSQL database adapter. Once it's installed, you can run Guillotina by simply typing the G command. This will run with default settings of no database connection and using a dummy DB. Later on we'll go through connecting to PostgreSQL with Guillotina. But first we'll go through the basics of using the REST API. Guillotina is now running on localhost port 8080. Just send a basic GET request, returns which databases are available. If you're not logged in, it will show none. So let's give it authentication credentials, which with the default config is root. And now it shows the configured dummy DB. That dummy DB is used in the URL as part of the REST API definition. From there, it shows the containers that are available. And right now there are none, so we're going to create a new container. The basic structure is @type with the JSON payload container. This is for creating all content, not just containers, and we're going to give it an ID of container. Once created, we can now do a GET request and we see the container is there. Now we can use that as part of the URL and it returns the payload. As you can see, we're using JSON LD-like responses. So once we're here, we're going to create an item inside this container, give it the ID foobar. The ID corresponds with the URL that it's going to be created at. So then we can access that content at container/foobar. Again, we'll need basic auth credentials to use with this request because by default all content created with the API is private. You'll notice that we use attributes in the responses with the @ symbol. This is meant to denote immutable attributes that are part of the content. In this case, ID, type, name, UID, static behaviors, amongst other things you might see with the attribute. Next we'll walk through configuring Guillotina. Guillotina uses YAML for its configuration as well as compatible with JSON. Guillotina ships with a cookie cutter with a sample configuration file. First install cookie cutter with pip and then do g create template configuration. So it'll allow you to configure a path as well to the configuration file. And when we look at it, we see that we have a database configured with PostgreSQL, describes the connection settings, host, port, password, and Guillotina host settings, root password, and some other authentication. And here's CORS, which is especially important, and a JWT secret is going to be important to configure for any deployment as well. So we can run with the new configuration by specifying the -c, but it errors, of course, because we don't actually have a PostgreSQL server running on that port or anywhere. So let's run a PostgreSQL server with Docker. You can look up the command in the documentation or elsewhere. Just get a PostgreSQL running. Once it's running, then we can launch Guillotina again with that configuration. Now we can go to Postman and notice that this returns a 404 now because we have a new database. So our old content that we created is gone, but we can see that the database URL is still configured, but now with Postgres. So let's create a new container, this time with the ID of foobar. So we can see that these IDs correspond to the URL structure. So we do a post request, see it returned 200, and then we can access that container /foobar with a GET request. And finally, we'll learn about installing applications to Guillotina, in this case Swagger. We'll just use pip to install Guillotina_Swagger. Once it is installed, we edit the configuration to add the application. We just add a list of applications and list the application we just installed, the Guillotina_Swagger. Now run Guillotina again. Once it's running, go to port 8080 in the browser /@. This will show the default endpoints available to Swagger, the public endpoints. But to get full usage of the Swagger functionality, you'll want to authorize yourself. This is just entering username and password. You can also provide a JWT token. It's also important to note the base endpoint URL. This is the base URL that Swagger will show all of the endpoint definitions for. Once authenticated, you can see all of the available endpoints for the authenticated user and interact with them just like any Swagger UI. And that concludes an introduction to Guillotina. Be sure to ask any further questions at gitter.im/plone/Guillotina.